Let's now move on to our next step. We have a login.do login servlet created, which is redirecting to a login JSP. When we type in the login.do URL, my first JSP is coming up, and you can see the response, and also you can see the headers and the params in your browser. That's what we have done until now. One thing you would have already noticed is the fact that when I type in localhost 8080, also the same response is coming back. So even when I type in localhost 8080 and localhost 8080/login.do, we are getting the same response back. How is it happening? The answer to that is in your web.xml. In the web.xml, we configured a welcome file as login.do. What our web server would do is whenever there's a request with nothing behind it. So when there is a request with nothing behind it, what it would do is it would automatically forward to login.do. So this forward would happen automatically, and that's why you would see even when I type in a URL without login.do, my first JSP is automatically printed. In this step, what we would discuss is something called a get parameter. How do we pass parameters to the request? One of the ways I can pass a parameter to the request is by using a get parameter. How do we do that? The way you pass in a parameter is by putting a question mark and giving a name of the parameter first. The name of this parameter, I would call it name, and I would pass in the name. So I'll say 28 minutes is the name. So when I do this, let's see what happens. Name is equal to in 28 minutes. Effectively, the URL you would be typing in is localhost 8080. Don't forget the HTTP in here, because sometimes Firefox is taking you to Google instead of bringing our web application up. So it's http://. So that's where it starts. Localhost 8080 is where our web application is deployed. I'm creating a parameter by name, and the value I'm passing in is in 28 minutes. And the question mark is to separate the URL from the parameters. So what I'm doing is I'm separating the web server name and the servlet name from the parameters using question mark. So after question mark, you can pass any number of parameters. So now when I press enter here, you'd see that my first JSP comes in. There is no change because we have not used the parameter in our servlet code. So there is no change in the JSP, in the output from the JSP. But if you look at the request, you would see a few changes. I'm going to the request. The way you can get here is doing right click inspect element and going to the network tab. So go to the network tab and you should refresh the page again. You should see this get request. And if I go to the headers in this particular request, you'd see a few important things. The request URL is now the complete URL, including the parameters that we passed. And this is a get request that we already know. This is a get request. We'll look at post request a little later. The status is 200. That means everything is fine. Along with the request, there is something called parameters. What are the parameters that were passed? The parameters which were passed as part of the query string. And what were the parameters? Name in 28 minutes. So name with a value in 28 minutes is a parameter that is passed along with this particular request. These are what are called request parameters. So the way I pass a get request parameter is by appending it after the question mark. Question mark name is equal to in 28 minutes. So name is a parameter. Now we have sent the parameter from the browser, but how do we use it from the servlet? That's what we are going to look at right now. So let's go back to our login servlet. In this servlet, we are not really using the parameter. Let's use it now. The way you can get a parameter from request is by using request.getParameter, and I would need to put the parameter name in here. So I would say request.getParameter name. Let's do a sysout. Not the best way actually. Ideally I should be using logger, but let's take a shortcut. Sysout, and I would put in the request.parameter name. Let's wait for the servlet to reload. It's reloaded now, and I would refresh this page. So now there's no change in what you see in here, but if we go to the console, you would see that the in 28 minutes is printed on the console. That's because we did a sysout.println request.get parameter name. In 28 minutes is printed in. Now let's pass in a different name just to make sure that we are actually picking up the name. I'm passing in a different name. Let's say I'm passing in Ritika, my daughter's name. What would happen? You'd see Ritika in here as well. We are passing request parameter from the browser and we are printing it on the output. So we see the request parameter on the servlet. So now I would want to pass this request parameter from the servlet to the JSP. So whatever value I'm getting in the servlet, I would want to pass it to the JSP. How do I do that? That's the next important thing that you would learn. The first thing which we learned is how we would pass a request parameter and see that in the servlet. That we have seen. We need to use request.get parameter name. So that gives me back name. So now in the name I have the request parameter value. What I want to do is now pass this name to the JSP. How do I do that? The way we do that is by using something called request attributes. In the request, you can put certain things as attributes and those attributes would be available to the JSP. So in the servlet, what we would do is we would put an attribute into the request. And in the JSP, we would take the attribute from the request and show it in the page. You have to differentiate between a parameter and an attribute. Get parameter is what you are passing in here. So the parameter is what is passed between the browser and the web application server. So from the browser, the parameter comes in to the servlet. The servlet takes the parameter and puts it as an attribute into the request so that the JSP can see it. How do I put it as an attribute? So you can say request.setAttribute, the name of the attribute. I'll use the same name, and then you can put in a value. So the value I would put in is name as well. So now I'm setting an attribute into the request. What's the name of the attribute? It's name. Now in the JSP, once I have put something in the request, put an attribute in the request and I forward it to the JSP, the attribute would be available in the JSP. Let's directly refer to that attribute in here. The way you take the value of the attribute is by using $ open brace name and close brace. That's how you access the name in the JSP. Let's now reload the page and see what comes up. There you go. You'd see localhost :8080 name is equal to Ritika, my first JSP Ritika. That whatever you pass in here would be printed out in here. So my first JSP in 28 minutes. There you go. In this step, we actually passed in a parameter, a request parameter from the browser to the servlet, and we also passed it from the servlet as an attribute, as a request attribute to the JSP, and in the JSP we used something called expression language. This particular thing, $open brace and the close brace, is called an expression language. The expression language is used to dynamically pick up content from request, session and other things. We will talk about expression language a lot more in further steps. In the next theoretical chapter, let's learn something about the JSPs. We'll talk about scriptlets and expression language.